Ahí estamos. Me encanta tu estudio, Mirza. Precioso el lugar. Se invita a perderse.
Gracias. Bueno, pues vamos a empezar ahora. Bienvenidas y bienvenidas al Pré-Evento Las Tres Marys, liderando el camino en el marco del primer Congreso de la Red de Investigación sobre Trabajo del Hogar en América Latina. Mi nombre es Mirza Aguilar y seré moderadora de este histórico encuentro. Un breve aviso: en el subwebinar, para seleccionar el idioma deseado, es necesario acceder a la herramienta en la barra inferior, en la pantalla Interpretación, y seleccionar el idioma en que desea escuchar la videoconferencia. Hay un mundito ahí donde pueden dar clic. Antes de empezar, un agradecimiento a nuestros patrocinadores para lograr este evento. De la Universidad Federal de Santa María, el rector profesor Luciano Schuss, y los directores del Centro de Ciencias Sociales y Humanas, profesora Sheila Kokurek y profesor José Remedi. La directora de Latin American and Iberian Institute of the University of New Mexico, Dr. Frances Hayashida. La Universidad de los Andes, la Escuela Interdisciplinaria de Altos Estudios Sociales de la Universidad Nacional de San Martín, la Fundación Termis, la Organización MICA, LASA y la Fundación Ford por otorgarnos la beca de proyectos especiales. Sin duda, nuestras panelistas no necesitan presentación, sin embargo, voy a dar una breve semblanza de ellas. Mary García Castro es socióloga, conocida por sus investigaciones sobre trabajo y género, es doctora en sociología por la Universidad de la Florida, trabajó para la Organización Internacional del Trabajo y como profesora de sociología en la Universidad Federal de Bahía. Mary Romero es doctora en Sociología por la Universidad de Colorado, profesora emérita del Departamento de Justice and Studies and Social Inquiry en Arizona State University, ha sido presidenta de la American Sociological Association, y por último, pero con mucho cariño, Mary Goldsmith Connelly, doctora en Antropología por la Universidad de Connecticut, profesora de la maestría en Estudios de la Mujer y del doctorado en Estudios Feministas de la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Xochimilco. Hay que destacar la importancia de las trayectorias académicas de nuestras panelistas. Sus publicaciones como Muchachas No More y Made in the USA fueron un hito y siguen siéndolo en los estudios sobre trabajo. Los aportes académicos de las tres Mary son fundamentales para entender la agenda académica sobre trabajo doméstico remunerado, tanto en América Latina como la dimensión migratoria de las trabajadoras del hogar. Este evento tendrá la siguiente dinámica: realizaré preguntas para que conteste cada panelista en el orden que prefiera. Así pues, empezamos. Hay ahora mismo 3 convocatorias de dossier sobre trabajo del hogar en revistas indexadas y múltiples libros editados en los últimos 3 años sobre el tema. Sin duda es impresionante cómo se ha movido la agenda de investigación y cómo el trabajo del hogar ahora es un tema imprescindible en la Academia de las Ciencias Sociales, donde el trabajo encuentra la intersección, la reproducción social frontalmente intersecta el género, la clase y la racialización. Pero quisiera empezar la charla sobre cómo fue para ustedes en los 80s. Nos pueden contar sus experiencias y, por otro lado, los obstáculos que enfrentaron en el camino de la investigación sobre trabajo del hogar remunerado y cómo fue posicionar el tema en una agenda de investigación. Mary García.
Olá, sinto-me honrada pelo convite da RITHAL para estar neste pré-evento do Congresso e com mulheres que muito admiro, Mary Goldsmith e Mary Romero. As perguntas são todas importantes, parabéns, RITHAL, Mirza Aguilar. Mas, por sua complexidade e pouco tempo que temos para as respostas, talvez incorra em algumas simplificações. Sobre minhas experiências no campo de pesquisa do trabalho doméstico remunerado, queria ressaltar que o interesse foi a partir de estudos sobre migrações internas e internacionais a convite da OIT. Primeiro, estudos no Brasil, em 1980, e depois na Colômbia. E aí também pela Organização Internacional de Migrações. Todos os achados levavam para a alta incidência das trabalhadoras domésticas remuneradas entre as migrantes nacionais e internacionais, o que me levou a meus estudos destacar gênero e trabalho doméstico remunerado e recorrer a debates feministas de corte materialista dialético. Em 1982, aquelas instituições internacionais me convidaram para fazer um estudo sobre o trabalho doméstico remunerado na Colômbia, mas o interesse do governo colombiano era provar que o serviço doméstico estava decrescendo e queria terminar com o crescimento econômico. Então, não se precisava de políticas públicas para as trabalhadoras domésticas remuneradas. Não tinham interesse que se ouvisse o trabalho doméstico organizado. Mas, além das pesquisas quanti-quali e históricas sobre o tema, eu comecei a me envolver com o sindicato da categoria em Bogotá, e aí foi um amor à primeira vista, admiração pelo trabalho, a defesa dos direitos dessas mulheres. Não parei mais. Quando, já nos Estados Unidos, em outra pesquisa, fui convidada por Elsa Chaney para organizar uma mesa em Lhasa, na mesma linha, com a participação das pesquisadoras sindicalistas, e veio o livro Muchacha. Daí foram vários estudos até hoje, em especial no Brasil, na mesma linha de relacionar pesquisa e assessoria a movimentos sociais e sindicatos com trabalhadoras domésticas, orientando-me a princípio mais por teorias do debate marxista e hoje combinando estes com enfoques decoloniais sobre reprodução social e interseções sobre gênero e classe. Foram muitos os obstáculos deste caminho. Começaram na Colômbia, quando o governo não aceitou os resultados da pesquisa pela ênfase nas demandas das sindicalistas e os resultados serem contrários à tese do governo de que o serviço doméstico iria desaparecer. A OIT foi proibida de publicar o estudo por quase 3 anos, mas derivou em vários artigos que foram publicados em uma mídia de organização feminista, como num livro de Madalena León, em 1993, outra pioneira que há que destacar. Outro obstáculo foi com os camaradas de esquerda e legitimar os estudos junto às centrais sindicais, que não consideravam a trabalhadora doméstica como parte da classe operária e que seu trabalho gerasse valor. Consideravam impróprio que se recorresse a perspectivas marxistas no estudo. Hoje, não. Já publiquei recentemente sobre o valor do trabalho doméstico remunerado em mídia de organização de esquerda. Outros obstáculos foram a escassez de recursos para a pesquisa, o desinteresse em 80 das orientandas pelo tema, mas hoje não. No Brasil, hoje, o maior obstáculo é a postura dos órgãos governamentais no campo da educação, contra a pesquisa acadêmica em geral, e o fato de não se contar, nos anos 90, com uma RITHAL.
Muchas gracias. Mary Goldsmith.
Okay. I'm going to... Mary Romero. Oops. No, we're all Marys.
Before responding to the question, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of the first Congress of the Research Network on Domestic Work in Latin America. The last time I corresponded with Elsa Chaney, she told me about her plan to organize a conference on household workers in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I agreed to participate. I am sure that she's among us today, delighted that her dream has become a reality. It is an honor to be on this panel with the other Marys who worked with her on editing Muchachas No More, and to have the opportunity to speak to researchers and organizers involved with this important Congress. I began thinking about researching paid household work in 1980 after a chance encounter with a 15-year-old live-in Mexican domestic from Ciudad Juarez in El Paso, Texas. Although my mother and many other women I grew up with did paid housework in Denver, it was always as a day work, not as live-in. I too had worked alongside my mother on weekends and summers, growing up and later when I was completing my dissertation. So while I was familiar with paid household labor, I was shocked by the way the young woman was treated in my future colleague's home, particularly the sexual innuendos and his sons and daughters' treatment toward her. She was completely ignored, except when ordered to do something. I was appalled by the paternalistic and sexist behavior of the Latino employer who was to be my future colleague at the University of Texas at El Paso. Rather than recognizing a domestic as a worker engaged in paid household labor, he framed the relationship as giving her the opportunity to learn how to use modern household appliances and to learn how to work. I began to wonder exactly what had been the experiences that I'd grown up with in Denver. While I had worked alongside my mother, I always avoided the employers and their children and left all the negotiations and interactions to her. I was aware, however, that instead of using my mother's name, Amalia, she was always referred to as Molly. I had experienced employers making racist comments and wanting to supervise the work to the degree of detailing the direction to use polishing the furniture. I also knew the work could take a physical toll on your body, and the work was part of the underground economy. When I expressed my research interest to the colleagues at the university, they tried to discourage me since the issue was not only the white employers in the country club area having live-in workers, but also middle and working class Mexican and Mexican Americans in El Paso who brought their less fortunate niece or cousin from Mexico, offering educational opportunity in exchange for helping the family. However, the practice was usually exploitative, and educational opportunity was limited to the family's needs coming first. Although referred to as part of the family, the niece and cousin was not treated like the rest of the children or the adolescents in the household. Nevertheless, I decided to write a proposal to conduct research in Denver, Colorado. I had wanted to include a participant observation, as Judith Rollins did in her research published in the book, Between Women. However, the Institutional Review Board at the Midwestern University that I was at the time would not approve it. I also had difficulty to get research proposal funded because it was seen as not an important issue, and I was encouraged to focus on immigration. I finally received a small grant from the Sally Butler Foundation. An unexpected obstacle I encountered doing the research was the reluctance of some workers not wanting to be interviewed. Although recommended by a family member, they sometimes denied doing paid housework. And other times, the person I was seeking an interview with lectured me on how I should be doing research on an occupation that our people could be proud about, such as teachers, lawyers, or nurses. I shared my own experience doing paid housework and that my mother was a domestic. I also expressed that this work was important because the work options were limited and the money that they earned helped their families. I also talked about the dignity of all work. However, I failed to convince some workers that their experience were important. As I began collecting background information, I became aware that although many Chicana and Mexican American women in the United States worked as domestics in the 70s and 80s, I could not find historical material except a reference showing that domestic service was a major occupation of Mexican women in the 1930s, and that domestic service was central in Americanization programs aimed at Mexicans and Chicanas in the 1930s. I was most surprised that Mexican women as household workers was not part of the emerging Chicana literature between the 1960s to 1980s. Whereas in African-American literature, household workers were the major characters in novels and plays. They were documented as major participants in the civil rights movement. However, Mexican and Chicana household workers were completely absent in both literature and history. This was particularly ironic since the only roles offered Latinas in Hollywood until recently were mostly as maids, and secondly as prostitutes and drug addicts. I also confronted obstacles in publishing and presenting research findings. When presenting my research at conferences or universities, I encountered colleagues asking questions framed as employers rather than as sociologists or academics. They had difficulty with my framing paid household work as labor. Instead, they wanted me to frame the research as assimilation to the middle-class American culture. Furthermore, they were not willing to accept the role of employer when they hired another woman to do the work, and instead viewed themselves as generous, almost as if they were engaged in charity work. And the relationship of the worker was she was like one of the family. They had difficulty engaging my analysis of the labor process, the lack of benefits, the lack of labor law protection, or how employers engaged in maintaining race, class, and gender subordination in their relations with the employee. The major feminist journal I submitted an article to kept sending me revise and resubmit. Again, the issue was framing paid household labor in such a way as to ignore the role that white middle-class women were perceived as employers when hiring someone. Instead, they could only accept my analysis if I supported the white feminist ideal at the time, and that was housework unites all women. There was a rejection to addressing race and class differences between women. The other obstacle was getting past the good employer versus bad employer or interpersonal relationships as a sole problem. They did not want to hear about working conditions, which involved physical labor. Instead, they argued that they too did housework at times. I had to point out that they did not do it every day, nor did they learn to clean 2 or 3 houses in one day. In their own jobs as professors or office workers, they expected benefits, health care, annual raises, paid vacations, and even paid work breaks. Furthermore, they would never consider offering their secretary their old linen jacket or other clothing instead of an annual raise. They did not comprehend that paid household workers want the same benefits and respect that they expect in their jobs. The final obstacle to having paid household labor as a research agenda was a popular argument in the 1980s that domestic service was a dying occupation. A leading sociologist at the time, Louis Kozner, argued that modern appliances removed the drudgery of doing household labor and workers were no longer needed. Furthermore, he argued that there was such a strong stigma against doing work that was considered dirty work that only the most inferior person in society would do the labor. And since America was a democratic society and the work relationship of mistress and maid had its roots in the master-servant relationship, the occupation could not survive another generation in the United States. And we know how wrong he was. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Ahora escuchamos a Mary Goldsmith.
Well, first of all, thank you for organizing the RITHAL Congress, and particularly this pre-event. And I feel very honored by your invitation to participate and honored to share this space for discussion with Mari Romero and Mari Garcia Castro. I'm not going to tell you about my prehistory in terms of how I became interested in domestic work, because that will take up 5 minutes at least of my time. But in the 1970s, when I proposed to carry out my dissertation research in anthropology about paid domestic work in Mexico, let's say, like Mary, it was not greeted with great enthusiasm by my advisor, a prominent economic anthropologist. He suggested I pursue other research interests about women and work, which would be more akin to what he considered was economic anthropology. And he would allow me to do it on women, but market vendors, craftswomen. However, I insisted, and I ended up doing my research on domestic workers in Mexico. Let's say in retrospect, a very broad study about domestic work and paid domestic work and capitalist development in Mexico, which was very attuned to Marxist feminist concerns at that time. No, I focused more on looking at what the obstacles and advantages were, sort of. I think one of the obstacles in the, particularly 1970s and early 1980s, that also was at the same time was an advantage. There was very little written about domestic workers during the 1970s. Most of it was from Europe, or as Mary has pointed out, was about about African-American domestic workers, no? Particularly migration from the South to the North, no? And also about migrants from other, let's say, and there are lots of studies about Polish domestic workers, other groups of migrants who were incorporated into domestic work. Also the history of domestic work in England and France. But then you wonder, like, what does that have to do with Mexico or other countries in Latin America, no? There was very little, at least in Mexico, about domestic workers. There are a few isolated articles and a few theses. It was, I think, pretty similar to other countries in Latin America, no? It was considered part of the informal economy, a bridging occupation, no? Like Mary, I also insisted that it was work, that it was not, I early on in Mexico heard the discourse about it being one being part of the family, no? So in some ways, it was a little lonely theoretically doing research about domestic work, and also lonely politically, because I think that if we examine what was going on politically, domestic work was not considered a pressing issue for feminists, at least in Mexico, nor was it considered a part of the research agenda, nor was it considered a question for social policy, labor policy. At the same time, given that there was so little written, you can in fact get a handle on the literature, which today is an overwhelming task. I get frustrated because I realize that there's so much that is very, very interesting that's being published not only in Latin America, but in other countries around the world, that it would be impossible even to make a dent into reading that literature, even with endless sabbaticals, which is kind of like my fantasy. No, I think it's also important to point when when you pose these questions to us. At that time, I remember in the early 1980s, Mexico's only feminist journal, Femme, did dedicate an issue to paid domestic work, and also Ilet Femme Press in Chile also reproduced a lot of the literature on domestic workers. However, that was it. As far as I can recall, and at least for my bookshelves, it was not a topic for interdisciplinary social science journals, certainly was not for anthropological journals, no? Another obstacle, which I think is kind of sort of similar to what Mary Romero mentions, what I found when I was doing my research was that academics, everybody, academics and politicians had an experience, an opinion, an anecdote about paid domestic work, no? So it was very, I mean, that also was an advantage, no? Because always somebody could give you some tidbit of their experience that I thought, when does field work start and when does it end, no? Outside of the formal interviews, no? I know ethically that could be questioned. I would agree, but I certainly couldn't get it out of my mind, no? So I think it was a real challenge to try to extrapolate domestic work from this mire of prejudices, remembrances, and to argue with other scholars and also political activists that domestic work, paid domestic work, was a legitimate topic both for research, political activism, and public policy, no? About the changes, no, I'm gonna be really fast on this. As Mary has mentioned, well, I had known Elsa Chaney from 1974 when I was a student of hers, along with Helen Safa, June Nash, the great La Trinidad Sagrada, de veras, no? And I met Iliashi Safioche, and I immediately wanted to learn Portuguese and thought, why, I want to be like her when I grow up eventually. I wasn't. But Elsa got back in touch with me in the early 1980s because I ended up being a political activist with domestic workers early on, in terms of I was close to the literacy training based on Paulo Freire methodology with a group of feminist activists, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and also that is when I met the people from the Young Catholic Workers, and let's see, I had well, I'm not getting into that, but at any rate, that is how I ended up like getting had the contact with Elsa Chaney, again, and Elsa invited me to participate in the LASA panel that she coordinated with Mary Garcia Castro, and to which she invited scholars, but also she invited domestic workers as as participants as well, as discussants. And I ended up beginning a relationship with some of the women activists who participated, which even if I had wanted to end, I could not end. It was just part of me at that point. And I think that Muchachas No More certainly was a seminal work, but I do not think that it really invited a lot of people responded to the invitation to carry out research on domestic workers, nor to have a political soul searching about domestic work and relations of exploitation between women, and also racism and classism. I think, however, since the 1990s, some of the changes in domestic work and why it has also become part of like a research agenda has a lot to do with the ILO. In terms of the 1990s, it's research on international migration, exploitation of child labor. And in this century, the crisis of care, and I do this consciously because that I mean, it's a much, let's like, what is that, versión descafeinada of terms of when we think about the exploitation of domestic workers by other women and also by the other members of their households. Also, I think the other factor that was contributed to the incorporation of paid domestic work, both in the political and the research agenda, was the growing recognition and commitment of international regional labor federations to legislative reform, support for migrant domestic workers, and a campaign for the ILO convention. This was like from 2005 on. And also the growing international domestic workers movement from this century, which made everyone reconsider notions of domestic workers, their agency, and also really their let's say their role in creating their own history, and also doing their own research, which I think is also something that's really exciting now. And I talk too much, which is nothing new. Okay.
Muchas gracias, Mary Goldsmith. Muchas gracias por sus respuestas de las tres. Sin duda, ahora Mary nos adelantó un poco esta pregunta, ¿no? Y me voy a centrar, digamos, en estas formas en las que ha ido cambiando el trabajo doméstico remunerado que efectúan las compañeras trabajadoras del hogar a causa del avance de la lucha organizada y de la implementación de leyes como la National Domestic Workers Bill of Rights en Estados Unidos, que ha pasado en 10 estados y 2 ciudades a nivel internacional, la Convención de 189 de la OIT, que ha sido un impulso para que gobiernos pues la estén ratificando, ¿no? Y que se integren algunas mejoras en las legislaciones laborales de varios países de América Latina. Sin embargo, aún falta mucho, ¿no? Como ustedes pues han estudiado. ¿Podrían compartirme cuáles son estos cambios que ustedes pueden observar a lo largo de los años? Y por otro lado, las persistencias a pesar de los avances en la legislación. Mary García.
Bueno, eu queria destacar algumas mudança dos estudos, tendo como principal foco o estado da arte no Brasil e o que se tinha nos anos 90, quando nós organizamos o Untitled Chapter. Eu creio que são mudanças muito positivas. Mais estudos por coautoria, assinados por pesquisadoras e sindicalistas, ou de escuta do trabalho doméstico organizado e se orientar por suas demandas, mais voltados a interesse das próprias trabalhadoras organizadas, como, por exemplo, a questão do envelhecimento das trabalhadoras domésticas, a questão do cuidado em relação ao Estado, a interação entre Estado e cuidado. Por exemplo, o problema das condições de vida, falta de políticas públicas, falta de creches, de serviços de saúde. Outro, diversos tipos de relações sociais vêm sendo mais estudados, como entre patroas e empregadas, a questão das alianças com outros grupos, outros trabalhadores do setor informal e das federações de trabalhadores formais também, com distintos movimentos da sociedade civil, muito investimento na área de formação, como divulgar os direitos legais adquiridos, inclusive considerando como um problema urgente o baixo índice de sindicalização. Aliás, problema de todas as categorias do chamado setor informal. Tema que vem contando também com a importante colaboração de ONGs feministas como a Temis no Brasil, que se combina pesquisa e ação. Além de perspectivas e colaborações feministas, O grande ganho nos estudos vem sendo o investimento na interseção classe, gênero e raça, os enfoques do feminismo negro, sendo que as próprias trabalhadoras organizadas mais vêm insistindo em seu estudo sobre a ênfase no racismo estrutural, no debate da raça, no debate da escravidão, no caso do Brasil, e que seja focalizado a sua influência no valor ou não valor socialmente reconhecido no trabalho doméstico remunerado, inclusive pelas próprias trabalhadoras domésticas e também campanhas dos sindicatos. Apesar da ampliação de estudos sobre o trabalho doméstico remunerado, ainda se necessita mais estudos, quer no plano das macropolíticas, como da micro, focalizando casos específicos, decolando de necessidades simbólico-materiais e contextualizadas no momento político, econômico e sanitário do país. No caso do Brasil, por exemplo, da grande perda de direito dos trabalhadores e o desencanto dos trabalhadores com política e sindicatos. Outro tema urgente é o fato de que as diversas conquistas legais das trabalhadoras domésticas, assim como até de outros trabalhadores, não contem com sistemas eficientes de fiscalização. Ou seja, ganhou-se muito em direitos de jure, direitos legais, mas não de facto, direitos de fato. Também ainda é tênue um campo específico sobre o sentido das chamadas economia de cuidado para o caso do trabalho doméstico remunerado. Há que se sair de reflexões teóricas que decolam de casos de outros trabalhadores. A questão dos cuidados e o trabalho doméstico remunerado pede perspectiva feminista em que o emocional e o material, o privado e o público se entrelaçam com distintos resultados e o lugar do Estado. Pedem também perspectiva antirracista e que o ponto de decolagem seja a diversidade de categorias no emprego doméstico. Há que dar mais ênfase no caso das diaristas, sua peculiar situação de não cobertura legal, a maior exposição a vulnerabilidades estruturais, como falta de cobertura legal e a qualidade dos cuidados pelo Estado, como dos transportes públicos. De fato, o empobrecimento e singular vulnerabilização das trabalhadoras domésticas, em especial diaristas, durante a Covid e a crise de realização do capital, pedem mais estudos sobre a informalização e a modelação contemporânea do capitalismo em países do sul global, decolonizando o saber. Obrigada.
Muchas gracias. Mary Romero.
A significant change is that household workers have a stronger foundation for organized struggle rather than experiencing isolatedly or depending on individual strategies for quitting one employer and finding an employer willing to pay decent wage and following the law that is outlined by the rights of domestics. Organized labor empowers workers when they act as a collective. The Bill of Rights campaigns in the United States has been very important in letting workers know about available resources. Domestic service, along with agricultural workers, were excluded from the labor laws that were passed in the 1930s in the United States to protect workers. This was done as a strategy to gain the support of the Southern Democrats, who were not willing to support the bill if African Americans were given the same labor protection rights as whites. Since the majority of African Americans were domestics and agricultural workers, these two occupations were left out of the legislation. Although some rights have been gained for agricultural workers, at the federal level, This is not the case for domestics. For this reason, the National Domestic Workers Alliance is campaigning to pass a Domestic Workers Bill of Rights in states and cities. This campaign has called attention to the plight of these workers and has produced materials for employers to follow the law more easily. However, there remains persistent challenges. A state-by-state campaign is labor-intensive and takes a lot of organizing that needs to be persistent over a long period. For instance, the bill passed in New York State took 6 years of grassroots campaigning. The New York Bill of Rights does not necessarily apply to domestics that have numerous employers in 1 week, but addresses the conditions faced by domestics and nannies hired full-time by one employer. Once the bill is signed, the struggle doesn't end there. A law is only as strong as the enforcement behind the law. The bills need political muscle behind it to assure that enforcement, as the bills exist now, the burden falls on the worker to file the complaint, which may also end up filing a lawsuit. This requires an ongoing level of advocacy to assist domestics through the process, since many of the working class do not have the skills to navigate the process on their own. In addition, the process usually requires taking time off from work if the case goes to trial. The United States has a very poor record for signing on to international human rights initiatives, such as the ILO Convention 189. Unfortunately, improving the legal protections for domestic workers has not become an issue that feminist or organized labor in the United States has rallied around or even added to their agenda. The National Domestic Workers Alliance has incorporated other important issues, which make these workers more vulnerable than other workers, such as immigration issues that have made it more difficult for immigrants from Latin and South America, more difficult to be granted asylum, the detention and deportation of their family members, and keeping families together and fighting to end the policies of family separation has become an important campaign issue. A related campaign is recognizing that these are essential workers and they must be granted dignity, safety, and security and included in the country's recovery plan. Ultimately, this includes establishing a path to citizenship of this predominantly immigrant population of workers. NDWA also has a beyond survival strategy to respond to the trafficking of domestic workers. Human trafficking has received a lot of attention as well as funding. However, law enforcement tends to focus their attention on sex trafficking, even though the trafficking of domestic workers is a much larger issue in the United States. Since these workers are already excluded from labor protections, there is a much stronger need for law enforcement to focus more efforts in stopping the trafficking of domestic workers. For over a decade, we have known the specific temporary work visas, as well as diplomatic visas, need to have more oversight to protect the workers. The federal government has not responded by training immigration officers or modifying immigration enforcement practices. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Escuchamos ahora a Mary Goldsmith.
Okay, I got it. Okay. I think that in terms of changes in the legislature, it's important to bear in mind that during the first decade of the 20th century, there were in countries such as Bolivia and in Peru, there were important legislative reforms that recognized more of domestic workers' rights. Also, it's important that to bear in mind also that in both cases, domestic workers organizations and their allies really played a very important role in achieving those reforms. No, I think that one case that certainly did shake things up a bit was the political change in Uruguay with Frente Amplio, which won the presidential elections in 2005, and in fact really did not renege on the promises they made during their campaign to totally change the legislature with respect to domestic workers, and also to promote domestic workers participation into collective bargaining processes, and also to support the strengthening of their union, and also not only to support legislative reforms, also to promote, for example, greater enrollment of the workers in Social Security. No, so that was sort of like that it happened in Uruguay, even though the argument might be, well, it's a smaller country. They have a history of respect for human rights. You know, remember, they also had a pretty terrible military dictatorship. And after that, they were certainly able to at least give us some hope for domestic work, or domestic workers' rights throughout the continent. No? So what I think is that in terms of the Convention 189, this was, I think, an effort between feminists within the ILO, feminists from different governments, domestic workers who were organized in different countries around the world, their relations with the international and regional federations. And after they finally were able to debate and approve a Convention 189, I think that the most revolutionary part of that convention is the idea that domestic workers should have exactly the same rights as other workers in each country. That principle of equality, I don't know how to say it in English, todos coludos o todos rabones. If we all are going to have a yearly Christmas bonus, then we all that should include domestic workers. If we do not have a in the law, if nobody gets a Christmas bonus, okay, domestic workers will not have that unless they can negotiate it. But that principle of equality and being a subject of human and labor rights was really something revolutionary, particularly because in the people who struggle for it at the international labor conferences were domestic workers themselves, who were on the on the margins of the discussion apparently, but they were there every day, 12 hours a day in those halls, dreadful halls where you can't go to the bathroom, you have to stay sitting, you have to be quiet all the time. So I think that is why the Convention on 189 has been really important for domestic workers. And also what's important to think about is the Latin American governments really were, several of them, such as Uruguay, Brazil, which was not the Brazil that we know now, of course, no? Argentina really pushed for the adoption of the convention. No, what has happened though in the countries which have later ratified and prior to ratification or after ratification have changed their labor laws, which I think are now 15 countries in the region, no, which including the Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean, no. There's always resistance about the workday, 8-hour workday. There's always resistance about payment of overtime. And particularly, there is still resistance when they're discussing national labor law reform, resistance about payment in payment in kind, no? And if they can be deducted, no, that can be deducted. And particularly the whole issue of inspection. But without inspection, it really is, there are laws without any teeth, or what they're not effective, no? And so also what is important to closely examine is who is included and excluded from the labor laws in our respective countries, no? In Mexico, it's very similar. It reminded me very much of to what Jurema Brites and Mari Garcia have said about Brazil. In Mexico now, they're playing around with this idea of who in fact is a casual or part-time worker. Are they really domestic workers? No, it's like if which is something that we have been struggling with here in Mexico, no? Because in the convention, it does say that an occasional worker who is not a professional domestic worker, who only occasionally does domestic work, should not be considered a domestic worker, which I think most of us would agree on. If somebody makes a Christmas dinner once a year or every 2 years, there's not a labor relationship there in terms of a wage labor. It's more you're selling, your services for that particular day, no? But what I think here is that how reform seems to advance, but also there will be these different ways in which the government, in fact, is able to make sure that not all workers are protected, no? And also there's something that I would agree with, I think with both of the other Marys, even if we have all these legislative reforms, what happens to racism and classism and xenophobia, and who in fact can have access to labor justice, no? In terms of needing translators, in terms of if you're a migrant, if your visa runs out, what's going to happen with the legal case that you have, that you sued your employer, no? Okay, yeah, I'm done.
Muchísimas gracias a las tres por sus respuestas. En estos cambios que sin duda pues se han dado, han derivado de una constante lucha de las compañeras trabajadoras y las organizaciones que dirigen. Tenemos el privilegio ahora mismo que algunas de ellas nos acompañen en este pre-evento el día de hoy. Aquí son varias preguntas. ¿Cómo se ha vinculado su labor como académicas al activismo con la causa de las trabajadoras del hogar y qué reflexiones han incorporado en su propia investigación a raíz de este diálogo constante? Y por otro lado, ¿cuáles han sido los desaciertos de las academias en sus interacciones con grupos vulnerables o de activistas y qué se puede hacer para mejorar?
Como eu já me referi, desde os primeiros trabalhos sobre o trabalho doméstico remunerado, no final dos anos 80, eu sempre os realizei por escuta e convivência com as sindicalistas. Eu creio que muito aprendi nos encontros de Conlactrarro, da Confederação Latino-Americana de Trabalhadoras do Hogar, e com as sindicalistas no Brasil. Em 1992, por exemplo, escrevi um trabalho sobre que o título foi Alquimia das Categorias na Produção de Sujeitos Políticos, Gênero, Geração, Raça e Classe nos Sindicatos e para as lideranças do Serviço Doméstico Organizado em Salvador. Ou seja, foi na prática, e por elas, como, por exemplo, quando Cleusa Oliveira, uma grande liderança brasileira, mulher negra, da Federação Nacional de Trabalhadoras Domésticas do Brasil, quando eu lhe perguntei qual é a sua raça, e ela me disse, mulher trabalhadora doméstica, negra, mulher trabalhadora doméstica negra. E eu lhe perguntei, Cleusa, eu estou perguntando a você qual é a sua raça. Ela me disse, eu não posso responder uma sem a outra. Isso, então, foi um prenúncio de algo que hoje é tão popular e que foi nos anos 92. Me chega a importância do enfoque da consubstancialidade de Kierkegaard, da interseção entre raça, classe e gênero, de Collins, Bell Hooks. Elas não leram. Cleusa não leu isso. Nem eu, naquele tempo, tinha lido. E nós chegamos pela prática. Eu vim acompanhando, em especial durante a Covid, o crescimento da alfabetização política das sindicalistas do trabalho doméstico organizado no Brasil e a sua visibilidade por lives, discursos, ações públicas, o que muito vem alimentando os meus trabalhos sobre uma perspectiva feminista decolonial de orientação materialista nas cores brasileiras. Vem colaborando para as minhas pesquisas atuais. Eu venho pesquisando hoje sobre produção africana e feminismos ocidentais, sobre maternidade, trabalho doméstico e reprodução social. E aí tem contribuído muito a acompanhar as formas singulares de resistências das sindicalistas do trabalho doméstico organizado, remunerado no Brasil. Como a mescla que fazem entre ação por direitos legais, alianças com outros movimentos, ênfase no reconhecimento da humanidade das trabalhadoras, principalmente das trabalhadoras negras, que são as maiorias do Brasil, e por aí no valor do trabalho doméstico remunerado. E como também elas privilegiam emoções e os vínculos entre elas, a ajuda mútua, mais que o Estado brasileiro, foi a sociedade civil no princípio, como as organizações das trabalhadoras domésticas que colaboraram com o bem sobreviver de tantas iguais. Creio que os desacertos entre a academia e os grupos vulnerabilizados e de ativistas, no caso do serviço doméstico remunerado, vem diminuindo muito no Brasil. A maioria das pesquisadoras, inclusive, que estão na RITHAL, que têm o contato, vão na mesma linha de relacionar ativismo com debate teórico, debate acadêmicos e análises quant e quali. Ainda predominam, são alguns casos, em que os pesquisadores não se dão conta que não há mais lugar para se ter as trabalhadoras domésticas apenas como objeto de estudo e não como sujeito de seu estudo, e que desconheçam a importância do que a Rita Segato também chama de metodologia da escuta e por demanda, e mais acento na produção do Sul, pontos em que há que mais investir. Obrigada.
Muchas gracias. Escuchamos Mary Romero.
In my own work, I have always located the research focus on the workers and their families. I've kept my analysis on the experiences of paid household workers, their labor process, working conditions, wages, best strategies for increasing wages, and establishing standards for employers to expect. I served on the NWDA's advisory committee for the National Domestic Workers Survey, which produced the publication Behind Closed Doors. I was a consultant to the Impacto film Made in America, which highlighted the organizing in Los Angeles, California. I served on the advisory committee Justice in the Home Conference at the Bernard Research Center for Women. More recently, I served as a researcher for the founding Congress of the International Domestic Workers Federation, and also at their second Congress in South Africa. I have tried to link the issues of domestic workers into the larger feminist discussions about issues that they've highlighted over the years. For instance, in the discussion about the work-family balance, I continually argue that all women need to be included in developing policies around these issues. This is not a challenge only involving women in the professions, but all working women. In discussions about the care crisis in the United States, I remind the researchers that solutions to the care crisis must include the workers that provide childcare and elderly care, not only as workers, but also they need resources to address their own childcare and elderly needs within their own families. Care work scholarship centers gender at the analysis, which ends up focusing on the plight of professional women, stay-at-home moms, and working mothers, rather than the low-wage migrant and immigrant workers employed as domestics and nannies. When low-wage migrant and immigrant workers are included, the scholarship tends to focus on immigration and ethnicity with a glaring absence of gender because of the failure to use an intersectional approach to the issues, which would highlight how various groups of women experience care work differently. By recognizing these differences, a more inclusive set of solutions can be developed. I must admit that I am critical of some US domestic organizers, as well as researchers, that incorporate the notion of love into their campaigns or analysis. Rather than framing household labor or childcare as a labor of love, I believe it is important to recognize the work as real work. And paid household workers or nanny skills are not based on love, but on experience and professionalism. I argue that the notions of love opens the employer and employer relationship to exploitation. Paid household workers deserve the same respect and dignity as their employers expect in their workplaces. When Arlie Hochschild wrote about globalized care work as a chain of love, she defined love as a scarce resource being extracted from other countries, rather than acknowledging reproductive labor as a scarce resource, and is the result of removing safety nets for families, as well as denying working families with the support they need to survive capitalism. Any discussion of emotion tends to centralize workers. For instance, in stereotyping Latina household workers as more caring or having natural mother tendencies, this is usually used to contrast the stereotyping Black immigrant women as difficult or aggressive. Too many times, workers are hired because of their vulnerability and their perceived subordinate position to the employer, and are perceived as less threatening to have in their homes, as well as cheaper. Another slogan that has been used by organizers who are not workers themselves was "work like no other work." I think this message undermines the struggle for labor rights. The major challenge is gaining workers' rights is for the larger public and government officials to understand that paid household labor is real work and should have the same rights as other work. Of course, I understand that these slogans by the organizers are attempts to gain employers' support, but I'm not convinced that they are effective. Concern about the care crisis has pulled a larger group of US researchers focused on a general category of care work. I'm also critical of classifying care work to not only include paid household labor, but also a wide range of paid care occupations such as healthcare workers, preschool workers, teachers, and other work involving care, because these jobs fall under the work covered by labor law and do not have the same working conditions. Very few of these researchers include domestics and nannies. When placed in a broad category of care work, the specific issues domestics and nannies face tend to become invisible. Policy issues generated from this research aims to create more safety nets and support for families, such as affordable childcare, elderly care, and care for the disabled. There is a concern about occupational segregation in many of the low-wage jobs in the care industry, but they seldom include immigrant workers or undocumented workers employed as personal aides. However, there is an exception found among home care workers employed through government and private agencies. Many of these researchers are working very closely with organizers. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Damos la palabra a Mary Goldsmith.
Okay, mira, para mí está muy difícil separar ahora lo que es ser académica y lo que es ser activista. Y a veces, y reconozco, okay. Entonces, inclusive yo recuerdo me sentí hace como 15 años cuando un colega muy, con mucho prestigio del Colegio de la Frontera Norte me dijo, bueno, tú eres activista, ¿verdad? Reconozco que a fondo me sentí ninguneado un poco porque sabemos que en la academia hay un desprecio al activismo. Por muy, I'm sorry, I went into Spanish because I think more in Spanish than in English. I'm sorry. Okay, but as I'm going to say, it's very hard for me to separate my life as an academic from my life as an activist. Because let's see, since 1986, I've been working very closely with domestic workers organizations. So it's impossible for me to participate in workshops or support work in terms of writing proposals or supporting producing material without that involving my life as a scholar. But it's also very important for me to acknowledge that everything I write has a domestic worker talking in my ear, whispering in my ear, particularly Marcelina Bautista, Aida Moreno, who for example, as Mary pointed out about care, when I remember I wasn't comfortable with the idea of care work because I thought, well, maybe it's also because I ignored a lot of the discussions on emotions and subjectivities. No? However, when I found also the domestic workers questioned the use of care as a way to render them invisible as workers and workers of a different class, a different race, a different ethnicity, I certainly could not critically utilize the concept of care. Rather, I had to also analyze the political dimension of almost everything we write. And I do want to say something to Mary Castro about her path-breaking article on the alchemy of class, race, and gender about domestic workers during the very early 1990s. I think she really, it points out how there are scholars who think about intersectionality from the South in a different way and are pioneering in that sense. And in terms of the historical thing, I started to work with an organization called Colectivo Atabal. Marcelina Bautista was also part of that group. A support group for domestic workers. Kind of makes you very critical of possible maternalistic tendencies that we might have as feminists. No, we were called out, and I really thank them for that. No, in terms of the organized domestic workers. No, I did not go to the founding Congress of Colactrao. I had a small child and was looking for work, and I didn't have the money. Marcelina went with another colleague from the Colectivo Esperanza, which formed part of Atabal at the time. And I remember that early on, the big discussion there was that domestic workers have to organize themselves. Other people cannot organize domestic workers. Ethically, politically, it's wrong, no? And over these, past 30 years, almost, I would say that I've been sort of in a dialogue, which sounds pretentious because I also wonder how explicit that dialogue is, how much I share, and am willing to to debate my work with my domestic worker sisters now. I would say that one of the things that domestic worker, that Marcelina, Aida, Carmen Cruz have also always made me very aware is the importance that they speak for themselves, that they can think and organize, and then invite me, if they like, as an acompañante, no? As to accompany, no? Because I think that I've been politically active on two fronts, really three, with here in Mexico with the union and with CASE, the Centro de Apoyo y Capacitación para Empleadas de Hogar, and also in Costa Rica with the Asociación de Trabajadores Domésticos sporadically. The thing is, I can't do research without getting politically involved. At one point, I was told that I should learn to keep a distance, but it's not part of me. No, I've done the work with the union in Uruguay, and I was really happy when I sent them my study. They were very happy about it as a way of sort of I don't know how you say it in English, a systematización of their experience, no? And also constantly with Colactrao, who for me has been really important part of my life over the since my 30s to my old age, no? So, and in this aciertos, I think there's some things of academics would be taking resources that in fact belong to domestic workers, no? Speaking for them or at them and not moving back, sort of, no? And I'm going to leave it at that. Okay.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a las tres por sus respuestas. Sin duda, en estos tiempos de pandemia, el contexto es una mención imprescindible, ¿no? Las preguntas ahora están ancladas en esta crisis sanitaria y económica, que más que un pasaje, a decir de Bruno Latour, es una mutación ecológica duradera e irreversible. Y estos cambios nos han obligado a reconceptualizar, reacomodar y repensar el mundo. Las preguntas serían, ¿cómo se han enfrentado como investigadoras a la inmovilidad que caracteriza estos tiempos también? ¿Y cuál sería el cambio conceptual para entender la importancia del trabajo doméstico remunerado, más allá de los binomios trabajo clásico, trabajo atípico, trabajo calificado y no calificado, o trabajo esencial y no esencial? Muchas gracias. Escuchamos Mary García.
Sobre a pergunta quanto ao enfrentamento pessoal como pesquisadora, a imobilidade que caracteriza esses tempos, primeiro, eu acho que se o foco são as trabalhadoras domésticas organizadas, não houve imobilidade em tempos de Covid. Mais impressionante é que elas se mexeram e muito. Houve, sim, empobrecimento, desemprego e vulnerabilizações várias, mas elas vêm enfrentando. Se tenho como referência o Brasil, insisto, as trabalhadoras organizadas têm sido bem ativas e dominam hoje a tecnologia para comunicações virtuais e sinto orgulho de me terem aceito como parte do seu grupo de Zap. Pessoalmente, eu tive muitos problemas de saúde, inclusive mental, muitos amigos mortos, como muitos de nós, e o que mais sofro como pesquisadora é o isolamento, o afastamento do campo para o trabalho qualitativo, inclusive por comorbidades minhas, que aumentaram, como dificuldade de locomoção. Hoje, meu campo são textos, debates virtuais e trabalhos com jovens, alunos e alunas, e o ZAP, da Federação Nacional de Trabalhadoras Domésticas. Sobre a pergunta ao que chama de câmbio conceitual, eu considero muito positivo a diversidade, eu não diria propriamente câmbio, mas a diversidade de enfoques teórico-críticos ao sistema de desigualdades sociais e a diversidade de temas relacionados ao serviço doméstico, como pode se constatar pela riqueza do programa do Congresso da RITHAL, que começa. Os conceitos são parte de enfoques teóricos. É muito positivo a maior diversidade dos quadros teóricos analíticos, como, por exemplo, o apelos a marcos do feminismo decolonial, do feminismo negro, do debate sobre distribuição e reconhecimento, contudo, há que cuidar para mais entrelaçar perspectivas estruturais do pensamento crítico e análises situadas, e revisitar debates que vêm desde os anos 90 e que são muito importantes, e sua contemporaneização, que enfatizam a relação entre a desumanização da trabalhadora doméstica, em especial se não brancas, e o racismo estrutural, a desvalorização do trabalho manual, o doméstico, ou o quadro político-ideológico do patriarcado, o lugar da informalidade no debate sobre classe e raça, como elementos estruturantes da sociedade, em que imperam a colonialidade do saber e do poder, e o caso das trabalhadoras domésticas. Esses informam ganhos políticos teóricos nos estudos atuais sobre essa categoria, mas que pede mais ênfase em revisitar clássicos, como os trabalhos de Fanon e de Mariátegui. E hoje eu citaria Rita Segato, mais uma vez, François Verger, e do feminismo negro, como Collins, Bell Hooks e Sueli Carneiro, no caso do Brasil, sobre ideologia e branquitude, e autodesvalorização das trabalhadoras domésticas remuneradas.
Muchas gracias. Mary Romero.
I've been catching up with the vast amount of new research coming out about paid household labor around the world. I have been particularly interested in the ways that visas are used to control workers and to link their presence in the country to their employer. Within the United States, I've tried to follow the legal arguments being made for the ways to establish labor law used in similar job situations that do have labor protections, such as requiring workers to stay overnight at their place of employment or other workers employed to work in the employer's home. I've been collecting online stories about paid household workers, which include not being provided protective masks, high layoff rates, and reports of employers not telling workers when they have COVID. Also, their experiences and challenges that they face as mothers when their children's schools go online. I think one conceptual change is to understand household work as state regulated and unregulated. This makes a distinction between the conditions that the state protects or the parts of housework that is unprotected. For instance, the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights frequently protect only workers employed by the same employer for 40 hours a week. Even under the Bill of Rights, many work arrangements fall outside government regulations. Another conceptual change is to understand household labor in the framework of the dignity of work and decent pay and benefits, or dignity of work and workers' rights. Previous conceptual framework make these important issues invisible. Wages, sick leave, and benefits are important, but we seldom discuss safety issues, the use of cleaning products that are toxic, smelling of fumes every workday, chemicals injuries to the skin, to the eyes, nose. Employers do not feel obligated to tell the worker if they were vaccinated or if they have COVID, but are not reluctant about asking the worker if they have been vaccinated or have been around others with COVID. In the United States, there is a disdain for the unemployed, yet not all workers are treated with dignity, nor do we agree about fairness and justice when we are the employer, only when the employee or worker. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Mary Goldsmith.
Okay. I agree with Mary that working online certainly has taken its toll physically, anemically, and psychologically. No, as I have often commented with my friends, we are privileged in the sense that we have our work, that we have a job, we have our income. However, our work days are sort of the days seamless between work and anything else, sort of, no? In terms of, let's say, the political work with the CONLACTRAO, with the Confederación Latinoamericana de Trabajadores del Caribe y Trabajadores del Hogar. I would agree with what Mary says about, in fact, particularly during the first year of the pandemia here in Mexico, no, not in Mexico, in the Latin American countries that have affiliates to the CONLACTRAO, there was an increase in activism, online activism. Every Saturday or at 7 o'clock in the morning, we had a workshop on technology, which I also took, and I think I failed. Okay, but also the other thing which was fantastic was this network of women throughout Latin America who were domestic workers, who became tight with one another, close to one another, who offered a sense like a network, a support network, no? And one of the we worked around the question of memory and history with some of the founders of CONLACTRAO and the experiences in the different countries. I did not organize it. I was a participant, but there was a lot of organization behind this. And the secretariat of CONLACTRAO certainly, I think, ended up with a tighter bond than they would have had in non-pandemic times. Does that mean my time ran out? Mirza, please. No? Okay. So on one hand, I think that during the first year, we had a lot of political organizing, also a lot of shared strategies in terms of how to defend one's rights, how to protect one's health, and also how to protect one's family's health. And also, which I thought was really cool, was this sharing of CONLACTRAO's history and a respect for domestic workers who from the 1980s and 1970s, such as Nair Jaine, Adelinda Diaz Uriarte, Jenny Hurtado, among others. No? The thing that was interesting was when people started to go back to work, is a lot of women still would be involved in the workshops, in the public transportation with their cell phones, or during their breakfast at work. They closed the door, and which I thought was interesting in terms of the possibilities that they were able to create and use to fortify the domestic workers movement in Latin America. During the last year, it's been harder because most of the women have gone back to work. No? I also think, I was also involved with the protocols here in Mexico, where there was discussion with the labor ministry. And as you've mentioned earlier, the tendency still is to look at domestic workers as contaminating. Like Phyllis Palmer wrote about African-American domestic workers in the US now, when in fact, the people who often were the source of contagion were the employers, not the domestic workers, no? And that was something that I worked with which I really felt honored to work with GASE and the union around these protocols in terms of the critiques that we had, the criticism we had, and suggestions we had for the Secretary of Labor. And also during the pandemic, I was carried out 2 projects. Some of the people are listening today, participants. We carried out a collective research about a pilot Social Security program for domestic workers in the state of Oaxaca. And I really enjoyed it because I realized that the quality of the work was probably better than the quality of much of the quality of the work that I've done is sort of like very solo, no? And also with CONLACTRAO, I've been involved with them on a shadow report about, or parallel report about Convention 189, particularly about the lack of implementation of 189 in the countries in which it has been ratified, and also the reasons that it has not been ratified in countries such as Nicaragua, I'm sorry, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, which brings me to the question of concepts. The person there's a Guatemalan scholar, Aura Gomez, Cachaquel anthropologist, who's written about domestic work, colonialism, and patriarchy in Guatemala. And I think a lot of her ideas are really innovative. She argues that domestic work, paid domestic work, more than being a job or a study from the viewpoint of employment, should be understood as an institution which is a pillar of patriarchy and colonialism to date in Guatemala. No, so I'll leave it at there. I think our time is ticking away.
Muchas gracias, Mary. Bueno, pues vamos a pasar al último bloque de las preguntas. Este bloque es cortito y aquí pueden responder ya sea solo una o las tres, si es un poco más rápido. Este maravilloso encuentro es un preevento de un congreso histórico, que es el primer congreso del RITHAL, que se lleva en el 2022. Participarán una cantidad considerable de investigadores, investigadoras, además de representantes de organizaciones de trabajadoras del hogar y público interesado en estos temas. Las preguntas de cierre van pensando el congreso. ¿Cuál es el mensaje o consejo a las académicas y académicos que están construyendo investigaciones contemporáneas sobre trabajo doméstico remunerado y quienes consideran sus trabajos como piedras angulares de su edificio epistémico? ¿Cuál es el mensaje que le dejan a las compañeras trabajadoras del hogar que nos acompañan sobre cómo la academia se puede vincular en estos tiempos de pandemia? Y al estudiantado y público interesado, ¿por qué deberían seguir al pendiente de estos temas? ¿Cuál sería la invitación que les hacen a las nuevas generaciones para involucrarse? Escuchamos, Mary García.
Eu creio que RITHAL e Conlactrarro são realizações dos sonhos de Elsa Chaney, do nosso Muchacha No More e das três Mary aqui, Mary Romero, Mary Goldsmith e eu. Pesquisadoras e sindicalistas em diálogo, co-participando de estudos, não somente de denúncias que são importantes, como Mary Romero diz, mais conhecer as condições de vida e de família das próprias trabalhadoras também, nas suas próprias casas, nas suas próprias relações, é muito importante, e discussões do valor do trabalho doméstico remunerado, inclusive para fortalecimento das organizações e pressões por políticas públicas e como aumentar o nível de sindicalização, como diminuir a distância entre ganhos em legislação e reprodução social das desigualdades, ou seja, entre os ganhos de júri e as persistências de opressões nas condições da vida, de fato. Eu não tenho mensagem. Eu estou aprendendo em cada reunião da RITHAL, nos papos por zap das sindicalistas e com as jovens pesquisadoras sobre trabalho doméstico remunerado no Brasil. Parabenizo a riqueza, a diversidade de temas neste congresso. Sigam e mais invistam na metodologia por demanda, metodologia por escuta, trabalhos quantitativos, trabalhos qualitativos, para a discussão do valor do trabalho doméstico para a reprodução do sistema e para outros vir a ser, como sair do sobreviver bem para o viver bem, proposta por feministas comunitárias e ampliação do que Ruston, o antropólogo Ruston, chama de cidadanias insurgentes. Obrigada.
Muchas gracias. Mary Romero.
I'm going to keep my comments fairly short because I know we're running out of time. I think one of the things that needs to happen is that workers need to make women and gender studies programs and women's resource centers at the university aware of their existence, and they can begin a conversation with researchers, and they can begin to access their resources, which might include joint training programs around various topics, such as strategies to impact local and state government, leadership development, marketing skills, developing negotiation skills, and grant writing programs. They should follow the practice of other organized labor in establishing organizing internship opportunities for students, beginning a dialogue with feminist, labor, and justice studies researchers on campus to make them aware of the kinds of data that they need for grant writing and organizing efforts. And I recommend making the academic community part of your fundraising efforts.
Muchas gracias. Mary Goldsmith.
Híjole, que después de esta, I told you, I think more in Spanish, after this stimulating discussion in terms of suggestions or messages, I would say to academics, particularly to young academics, I would suggest that they always, learn really to listen, but I mean really to listen to domestic workers in terms of to think that domestic workers are also subjects of knowledge, that they also construct theory, and to listen to them as they do that, and also to give them credit for it, no? In their work. Also, I think even though it's hard to conceptualize that today, not to, that they also have an ethical responsibility in terms of returning their work in some form that is useful to the domestic workers, no? Particularly to the organizations, no? And to the general public, I agree with Mary Romero in terms of the importance of sharing skills that one might have as an academic in terms of grant writing, and also in terms of organizing workshops, in terms of constructing strategies whereby academics and domestic workers could pressure the government, and also to be generous with one's purse. If one has money as an academic, domestic workers always are requesting funding formally, not as some sort of maternalistic thing of like, ayúdame por favor, no? Because right now we're involved in a funding campaign for a domestic workers co-op here in Mexico, which I'm not that shameless. I will not put it here in the chat, but I will remind you during the upcoming days to contribute generously. No? Okay. And thank you. I think thank you.
Muchas gracias a ustedes. Bueno, vamos a dar inicio a preguntas de la audiencia. Ya nos han estado siguiendo por YouTube y también en esta reunión virtual de Zoom. Voy a ir dando preguntas una por una y pues podrán responder. Primero les mandan muchas felicitaciones varias veces y la pregunta es: en Brasil tenemos la presencia del sindicato patronal en Sao Paulo y acuerdos colectivos que establecen tarifas o remuneración para los diferentes servicios realizados. Los demás estados no. ¿Cómo ha sido la experiencia en otros países? Digamos, diferente a Brasil. ¿Hay alguna que quiera platicar de otras experiencias? Digamos, quieren, digamos, pensar esta situación de Brasil y en referencia a otras latitudes. ¿Alguna quiere contestar? Mary Goldsmith. Tu audio, Mary. Nada.
Yeah, I'm back to mute. Let's say Argentina, I understand, has collective bargaining. And I would, let's see, I think you should probably get in contact with the unions there, the OPAC and the Sindicato de Personal de Casas y Familia in Córdoba, who have had experiences in terms of also negotiating between the unions. And I think their Ligas de Amas de Casa, I'm not quite sure, and also a sindicato de amas de casa, I won't translate, the Housewives Union, and also the the League of Housewives. Okay. I'm sure that one of my Argentinian colleagues could contribute more to that. And let's say in Uruguay, they've had, I think, either 5 or 6 collective bargaining agreements between the Sindicato Único de Trabajadores Domésticos, the oh, okay. I thought I lost the electricity. And the Liga and the Housewives League. And over this period, there are a lot of things that have been achieved. Particularly, they've discussed salary levels, different salary levels for workers. Particularly, they have elevated the salaries of those domestic workers who earn less. Also, they have negotiated a number of other issues, such as questions of additional pay if you work during the night, questions of uniforms. But there one issue which has been very problematic, which I understand that you have managed to negotiate in Sao Paulo, is the question of different wage levels for different categories of work. In Uruguay, they have not been able to reach an agreement on that, about that question, particularly because of the resistance from the Housewives League. And also I understand they have had that they have done some collective bargaining between the National Federation of let's say domestic workers in Chile, with organizations that represent employers. In Mexico, has not been the case.
Muchas gracias.
The problem there is that most employers do not want to recognize themselves as employers. To begin, let's see.
Muchas gracias. La siguiente pregunta de la audiencia es ¿cómo consideran que puede abordarse la situación de las mujeres indígenas en el trabajo doméstico? ¿Podrían recomendar algún estudio?
Here in the United States, most of its historical research, one of the things that occurred in the institutes that were set up for African Americans, as well as the Indian boarding schools, was establishing domestic service for the women. And so there has been a lot of historical research on the kind of impact that had on the indigenous communities. However, in the United States, the indigenous communities is off on the reservations, and so they're it's mostly where you find the large urban areas of domestic workers. So it's not an issue as it would be, like I'm sure, in other parts of the world.
Muchas gracias.
Okay.
Mary García.
Eu, de fato, não conheço trabalhos contemporâneos. Devem haver no Brasil, mas eu não conheço. Agora, eu queria lembrar que, a nível do debate político, econômico, Mariátegui foi um dos primeiros, já no final do século XIX, que advertia, que achava um absurdo que as esquerdas na América Latina não dessem mais valor e não mais estudassem o trabalho das mulheres indígenas, considerando que as mulheres indígenas como trabalhadoras domésticas. Ele tem uns 3 textos sobre a importância da mulher indígena trabalhadora doméstica, como elas eram importantes para qualquer esquema, no sentido mais de discutir as relações patrões e trabalhadores e para possíveis mudanças, inclusive no sentido revolucionário. São ensaios, mas eu muito recomendo a quem está com interesse.
Muchas gracias. También por el chat, Mary recomienda a Catrina Peñaranda, Jimena Flores Álvaro. Y también Erin nos dice, Aura Cumes, Sebrín Durín. Bueno, la otra pregunta que tenemos de la audiencia, bueno, antes Mary está mostrando un texto.
Mirza has an article here, but also Aura Cumes has an article as well, and there are several other articles about indigenous domestic workers from different Latin American countries. Okay.
Muchísimas gracias. Entonces, pues muy recomendado el libro Trabajadores en la Sombra.
Iconos en estudios sociales. There are people from different students and professors from Flaxo who have Ecuador who have written about indigenous domestic workers and their organizing and question and other issues. ¿No?
Muchas gracias. Entonces vamos a la siguiente pregunta, que sería, en los hogares hay una tendencia a negar derechos a las trabajadoras, ¿no? Por parte de los empleadores. En este aspecto, le gustaría saber a quien hace la pregunta si se pueden compartir experiencias de política pública sobre la vigilancia en las condiciones de trabajo y de salud para las trabajadoras. Mary García.
Em Brasil, nós temos a PEC das domésticas, que é uma legislação que foi conseguida com muita luta pelas trabalhadoras domésticas organizadas e que seria a forma de operacionalização da Convenção da OIT, pelo qual haveria que registrar as trabalhadoras domésticas e elas terem acesso a seguro social, a férias, a todas. Então, existe esse material. O que nós temos... Agora, o que fizeram os patrões? Uma forma de burlar é que essa legislação e todo esse programa seria para as trabalhadoras internas ou aquelas trabalhadoras que dormiam no trabalho, e as que assinavam, ou então as que trabalhassem mais de 3 dias na mesma casa, consideradas, então, tendo a carteira de trabalho. Ora, isso vem já aproximadamente há 8 ou 10 anos. E no Brasil, das trabalhadoras que têm carteiras assinadas, que cada vez são a minorias, porque os patrões recorrem a um subterfúgio, que é a diarista, de trabalhar só 2 dias, e aí não cumprir essa legislação trabalhista que as trabalhadoras conseguiram. Das trabalhadoras domésticas que têm carteira assinada, segundo um estudo recente de 2 ou 3 anos, menos de 10% dos patrões têm cumprido esse programa. Na Bahia, recentemente, se fez uma experiência de fiscalização por amostra de algumas casas, porque o que geralmente se dizia era que como é que se vai fiscalizar uma casa de família, como entrar. Mas, se é considerada patrão, se assinou carteira de trabalho, a fiscalização pode entrar. É verdade que, para que essa lei esse programa tenha mais eficiência, há que aumentar o número de sindicalizadas e há que aumentar o conhecimento das próprias trabalhadoras. Olha aí, alguém disse, obrigada, que o estudo da Diese, 75% das trabalhadoras domésticas no Brasil não têm carteira assinada, e as que têm carteira assinada vai a quase 11% as que estão assinando o E-Social, que está assinando isso. Ora, então, o governo teria condições, mas o governo não está usando as possibilidades. Há formas, mas em relação às diaristas, já é outro caso, dessas que não têm carteira assinada e que são diaristas, há toda uma luta do trabalho doméstico organizado que se tenha uma legislação especial, mas aí isso ainda falta muito.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguna? Mary Romero, Mary Goldsmith.
Just a very quick point about inspection is that one thing that is sadly the case in most countries is that there are not enough inspectors from the government. They usually have very few labor inspectors at the secretaries of labor. So we would need to, as I have been told, they need to increase the number of inspectors, and it's also very important that the inspectors are properly trained. That often it's considered that if they're a lawyer, if they've come from a union, then they know about labor inspection. But it really is like it is something that does require professional training, no? In order for them to carry it out effectively and significantly, no? And
Muchas gracias.
I'm sorry if I always bring up Uruguay. Uruguay at one point worked closely with the government, worked closely with the union. The union would tell them about where they thought there were violations of domestic workers' rights, because they would observe at what time the women were getting on the buses, let's say we're getting off the buses to go to work, and what time they would get on the buses when they were leaving, no? And then later they would do like a supposedly random, the government would do a random inspection in the neighborhood, which was also a way to, how do you pick which area of the city? How do you pick which households to inspect, no? And also the other, let's see, there was something which I thought was pretty cool in Uruguay, where even if the inspector did not go within the home, if you do have some sort of contract, which they have in the case where they're registered for Social Security, there's like minimum information. at least if you can request that the receipts for Social Security payments are included, and they used to hang on the door, like as in the hotels where you say, "Do not disturb," they'd hang something on the doorknob of the employer's household, would say, "In this home, they respect domestic workers' rights," which in terms of creating a culture of respect for domestic workers' rights. Jurema has all kinds of great comments.
Muchísimas gracias. En todo el chat hay muchas felicitaciones, muchas celebraciones y muchos agradecimientos por esta pues constante expresión de todo lo que nos han contado. Les queremos agradecer de una forma muy grande pues por este encuentro histórico. Ha sido un privilegio para mí estar moderando este encuentro, este pre-evento. Damos las gracias a las organizadoras, a los patrocinadores, a quienes nos acompañaron este día por este evento en Zoom y también por YouTube. Va a quedar grabada la sesión en las plataformas de YouTube y animamos a todas las personas de la audiencia a inscribirse y asistir al primer congreso de la Red de Investigación sobre Trabajo del Hogar en América Latina, RITHAL 2022. Sin duda todavía nos quedan algunas preguntas al pendiente y también mucho diálogo que esperemos en estos días del Congreso pues se pueda seguir con esto. Ha sido de verdad, este es un momento histórico. Muchísimas gracias a nuestros panelistas, a todas las organizadoras y a nuestros asistentes. Muchísimas gracias. Esperemos que no sea el último, sino muchos diálogos. Muchísimas gracias. Felicidades. Y con esto cerramos el diálogo. Que tengan muy buena tarde y acompáñenos en el Congreso que está por empezar el 26 de marzo. Muchas gracias.